I talk a lot on this podcast about the most powerful storms to have ever hit, no matter where they hit. They change the area that it affects and the lives that it touches. Then there are the stories from the opposite end of the spectrums. The storms that are so rare for where they happen that even though they are not terribly destructive, they still hit the record books. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Think of a state in the U.S. where you would last suspect a twister. Massachusetts does not count because we did an episode on them the day before yesterday. No, today we hit the last frontier, the state of Alaska. This day in weather history. It was on July 25th back in 2005 when a rare tornado actually touched down near Sandpoint in the state of Alaska. Just like on the 23rd, when there had only ever been 3 tornadoes ever reported to have ever touched down in the Cape Cod area in the past, here in all, 4 tornadoes have been observed in Alaska dating to 1959, that according to the Tornado History Project. But there is also a big caveat to even that. The state is enormous, and most of it is, even today, still uninhabited, so there very likely might have been more, but they've gone unobserved. Interestingly enough, the state of Alaska does physically stand a better chance of tornadoes than Cape Cod, given its vast interior expanse of land, and thanks to climate change, the frequency of enough hot air in place at times to clash with the driving cold is a perfect recipe. What am I talking about? I'm diving into what a tornado is and how it forms. We're going to need to know that before we move on, so let's review. A tornado is a violent, dangerous, rotating column of air. You've probably guessed that just by seeing The Wizard of Oz. You also normally see them when you also have severe thunderstorm activity. They are in contact with both the surface of the Earth and that rising cumulonimbus cloud, or in rare cases, the base of a cumulus cloud. You may have seen them floating in the sky. That is a funnel cloud. That's where they sort of sit down out of the cloud and they don't actually touch the ground. It is only when they actually touch Earth and start to kick up the dust and debris that the connection is made, and they are called, therefore, at that moment, a tornado. Tornadoes range in intensity on what is known as the enhanced Fujita scale. The most extreme tornadoes can attain wind speeds of more than 300 miles per hour. That's 480 kilometers per hour. Measure a width of greater than 2 miles across. That's an astounding 3 kilometers across. And maintain that terror on the ground for dozens of miles at a time. That's right, they have been known to travel more than 100 kilometers at a time. And I actually have featured a few of these on this podcast over this past year. But there's no need to get into any more Earth and atmospheric science than that, because what hit Alaska back in 2005 was, well, let's just say it was on the weaker side of the spectrum. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. And oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. The U.S. National Weather Service staff reported that the July 2005 funnel cloud on the Kenai Peninsula came out of what was otherwise a rather unimpressive cloud formation that resulted in a mere shower that wasn't even large enough to create lightning. But as the old saying goes, and tell me if you've heard this one before, anywhere and anytime conditions in the atmosphere line up, tornadoes can be spawned. Am I right? Hey, in meteorology, that's an old saying. And the best example of anytime, anywhere played out right here in the 49th State of the Union. So when this tornado touched down near Sandpoint, area elders commented that they had actually never before ever even seen a tornado. Sandpoint is remote. As I mentioned off the top, it is found on Popoff Island, one of a dozen or so Chemagan Islands at the beginning of the chain of the Aleutian Islands. So where is this? It's actually about 570 miles, or almost 920 kilometers southwest of Anchorage. It's quite close to the tip of the Alaskan Peninsula. So I say again, it's remote. With a population then of only 908, those who saw it were looking across the Popoff Strait to nearby Unga Island, and it was in that distance when they witnessed that very rare tornado when it touched ground in its totally uninhabited mountains. This day in weather history. Tomorrow is July 26th, and we will revisit the story of an epic California fire-nado. You heard me right, a tornado made out of fire. I already explained what makes up a tornado in this episode, so imagine that, made of fire. That's tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.